We are beginning the second chapter of the Yoga of Integral Knowledge in the Synthesis of Yoga. And in the very first sentence, Sri Aurobindo summarizes the entirety of the first chapter's discussion and then moves quickly to the theme of this chapter, which is titled The Status of Knowledge. And in this chapter, he discusses what exactly we mean by knowledge in the yogic sense of the One. So his first sentence summarizes the previous chapter: the self, the divine, the supreme reality, the all, the transcendent, the One in all these aspects is then the object of yogic knowledge. Very simply put, but there are many interesting suggestions here, one of which he has elaborated much earlier, right in the beginning, in the preface, the introduction, where he discusses the nature of the synthesis. And there he explains that this yoga is integral for many reasons. It is integral because it takes up the whole of our nature, leaving out nothing. It is integral because the way that it follows is all inclusive, it includes all possibilities. Third, it is integral because it aims at an integral realization of the divine. And so it is this aspect of the integrality which is very succinctly stated here. And you will remember we looked at what, what these different words mean. They are all aspects of the One, capital O, indivisible all. But in the words he has placed here, they follow an interesting sequence. The self, capital S, is when you go deep within yourself to realize that One, and it is a personal discovery, a personal experience. And so it is capital S, self, even though the self realized may be cosmic and all inclusive. The divine here we may make equivalent to the Brahman, or it is the all or the self of the universe, which is an objective experience when we go to the essence of the universe itself. The third is the supreme reality with a capital R and a capital S. And that is the experience when we approach to know the universe through the senses. We seek to know a reality, but the reality which we know is phenomenal, and there is a true reality behind, and it is that. And so you have a most subjective beginning to a more objective description of the divine, and then from there, the all, the one who becomes all, so the manifest aspect of the totality, and the all with a capital A is not only all things, not only all forces, not only all experiences, but it is all that could be, that is, that could have been, and which did not appear in the manifestation, all possibilities across space and time. And then the transcendent. With all this, we may still reduce that one to something measurable, knowable. And so the last aspect reminds us that after all that we know of the divine, of the one, he still stands beyond all our capacity to know. So these are very interestingly sequenced 5 aspects of the one. And we must know that one in all these 5 aspects, otherwise, we have not fulfilled the integral yoga's objective. If we know only one of these aspects, it is easy to stop and say, I know the divine, the reality, the one, and then it stops there. And then there'll be this whole fourfold other side which we have missed out. It is only when we know all these 5 aspects and know them as aspects of the same one, then we have the integral realization. And so this complete realization is the object of yogic knowledge. But then the question would be, what do we mean by yogic knowledge? I know these words already. I know what they mean. I have all the right ideas, having read all these books. But that's not the knowledge that is intended. And what is the nature of the knowledge? And that's why the status of knowledge. That's the theme of the rest of this chapter. So he begins with pointing out, defining what we normally mean when we use the word knowledge. And you'll see in the next two paragraphs where he discusses this, there are some extraordinary statements, so succinctly stated, capturing the whole approach of the mental consciousness and humanity. There is something quite extraordinary. So he says, ordinary objects, the external appearances of life and matter, the psychology of our thoughts and actions, the perception of the forces of the apparent world can be part of this knowledge, but only insofar as it is part of the manifestation of the One. So, in this statement, there are two very important things which we find. First, he sequences how human knowledge develops. And second, he says all of this human knowledge is also included in that knowledge of the One, but in right relation to it. And what is the nature of that relation? So we'll explore both of these. When the human consciousness begins to explore the universe and acquire knowledge, it starts with objects. It is the inquisitive nature of the animal mind to handle objects and get to know them better. But the first exploration is of the form of the object and the external appearance of life and matter. That's a more general thing now. First, ordinary objects limits it to the objects as they are, and then it generalizes to external appearance of life and matter. So this includes plants and animals. And then it moves to a deeper level, the psychology of our thoughts and actions. Having understood that the world is made of all these stones and plants and animals and human beings, I begin to wonder what is it that motivates them? What's happening inside their thoughts? And at first, it's an exploration of someone else's thoughts, trying to understand them. And later, it becomes an introspective process to observe how I am thinking. And the more I begin to understand my own thoughts and motivations, I begin to project them onto others and seek to understand them in terms of my understanding. And then sometimes I find it doesn't work. And I realize that there are many other ways of thinking, knowing, and motivations. And so there's a whole exploration of this psychological domain of thoughts and actions. And you'll notice also in this sequence, the knowledge includes not only awareness of the things, but also consequent to it, control, influence over those things. So as I begin to appreciate how thoughts and motivations for action work, I begin also to try to manipulate, to coerce, to subtly influence others' thoughts and actions. And then it moves from there to another level, the perception of the forces of the apparent world. This is going a step of abstraction behind. What are those forces which compel us, which even influence our thought processes, and we are helplessly pulled by and pushed by them? And we realize that there are such forces as we go behind the scene to a dimension which we may call now occult. Occult because it is hidden from us right now. And he stops there because everything after the occult, when you cross beyond the occult, would be the spiritual and would already come in the domain of what has been discussed. So, all of this domain, which is to us not spiritual, so to say, is included in and a part of that knowledge, but only insofar as it is part of the manifestation of the One. And this is the right relation, the true relation in which we have to eventually begin to see everything. And this is really the status of what we call the higher mind. The higher mind knows things, knows objects, knows forces, deals with external realities, but always with an awareness of the backdrop of the self. It puts them always in relation to that underlying reality. And as we go higher in the scale of consciousness, that relationship becomes more and more intimate, more and more direct and obvious. But in the higher mind, it is the first beginning of that experience, where you have always the sense of the backdrop of the self. For example, you may look at a very ordinary situation where a few people have gathered for a function, for a celebration, and you would see that this is part of a much larger, timeless tradition, and you would see it in many different aspects. You would see that this gathering is an outcome of something which was always there, and it will keep repeating across time in different forms perhaps, but the essential truth of it will continue. The sense of an underlying timeless continuity or an underlying essential truth which is invariant or something which is universal, cosmic, being everywhere present, these are often the gateways through which the sense of self is related to the most ordinary things. But the idea is in the consciousness of the viewer, there will be this backdrop of the self, of which this is a special expression, a unique outcome or form or manifestation. So, this, when he says the most ordinary objects will also be part of this knowledge, insofar as it is part of the manifestation of the One. And this would be natural from the higher mind upwards. For the existing functioning of the intellect, it's not natural because the intellectual consciousness still does not feel the concreteness of the self. It becomes at once evident that the knowledge for which yoga strives must be different from what men ordinarily understand by the word. So it becomes evident, and how, because already we are dealing with something which is not part of what we call knowledge. We have this vocabulary in Sanskrit, vidya and avidya. And vidya is the knowledge of the one, avidya is the knowledge of the multiplicity, as Sri Aurobindo defines it. But in the way it has come to mean practically, uh, avidya represents, in popular terminology, all worldly knowledge, and vidya is all spiritual knowledge. But really, it has to do with this multiplicity and oneness, which is what makes it spiritual or worldly finally. But we have this very clear distinction and even an opposition between these two kinds of knowledge. And so, what is the normal use of the word knowledge? For we mean ordinarily by knowledge an intellectual appreciation of the facts of life, mind, and matter, and the laws that govern them. It's a very interesting definition. An intellectual appreciation of the facts of life, mind, and matter, and the laws that govern them. So, if the appreciation was not intellectual, it would not be knowledge. It is the intellect's appreciation of it which makes it knowledge. But he doesn't say, you see, we have to define knowledge in terms of different terms. The intellect's awareness of it is not it. The intellect's appreciation of it. You may be aware of things, but you have not yet grasped them, you have not yet appreciated them for what they truly are. So the appreciation is important, and facts of life, mind, matter, and laws that govern those facts. So if you see the bulk of modern education, what we call knowledge in this sense, is about learning facts and regurgitating facts. And then as you go into higher education, we move behind facts to the laws which govern the facts. Why those facts are the way they are, what are the laws? But then if you ask the question, why are the laws the way they are, it stops. At least current knowledge does not go that far. And that's all there is. So it's easy to have objective tests because you're finally dealing with facts and laws of those facts. And the laws as they have been proclaimed by somebody or the other who cannot be disputed because he's considered the authority on that subject, and so on. So even the sequence here is interesting. Life, mind, and matter. Matter is coming last. And you wonder why. Because when the intellect begins to appreciate the facts of things, first it engages with the facts of life. Because that has the most practical value for you. When will the sun rise? When will the rain begin? Should I put the clothes out now, today, or not? You think in terms of what has practical value in the normal processes of life. And then next, you go beyond that to studying how people think or how we think or what our understanding of things is. The study of matter and the facts of matter proper, which we would call physics and chemistry, that is already penetrating into a domain that is outside the purview of our immediate senses. And that comes last, only when all the rest has sufficiently developed. So this is a knowledge founded upon our sense perception and upon reasoning from our sense perceptions. And it is undertaken partly for the pure satisfaction of the intellect, partly for practical efficiency, and the added power which knowledge gives in managing our lives and in utilizing for human needs the overt or secret forces of nature, and in helping or hurting, in saving and ennobling, or in oppressing and destroying our fellow men. And in brief summary, he has outlined all of the motivations of the human quest for knowledge. And you see, none of these have anything to do with the deeper reality. All of these are part of the so called practical world. So he first defines this of this knowledge. The knowledge itself is founded upon sense perception and reasoning from sense perceptions. If you do not have sense perceptions, it's not real, it's fantasy. Very often in the whole domain of psychiatry, we have this term hallucinations. And even if many people experienced a reality which is not experienced by others, you will say mass hallucination. But it's only a term which covers up the fact that I don't know what it is really. And because I could not see it, although 100 people saw it, it cannot be true. So you reduce everything to purely what is perceptible to the senses. And if it cannot be replicated, even though their senses saw it, if I cannot replicate it with my senses, it's not true, it's a hallucination. And the fact is, a huge number of people are locked up in various mental institutions because what they see is not being seen by others. And what they see is actually a sight, it's a reality of a subtler domain. They're seeing objects, they're seeing people, they're seeing forms, they're having conversations with beings of subtler worlds. And because that's not part of our gross physical senses, those people are locked up as having hallucinations. Strictly speaking, all so called hallucination is reality of other worlds. There is nothing which is unreal. There may be mixed perceptions of underlying realities or circular realities. The perceptions may be wrong or mixed, but the fact is you're seeing something which actually exists. And then there is a reasoning which builds on those sense perceptions. So if all of the logical reasoning that we have built up on a limited set of sense perceptions is accumulated today and put in a book, we will say, oh, here is the compendium of human knowledge. For a long time, this kind of thinking was highly valued, and people used to speak of the 30-volume set of the Encyclopedia Britannica, massive volumes each of 10 or 15 kilos, and everything, all knowledge which is contained there, all facts basically, and the idea of reasoning based on those facts until one fact pops up which puts all of this reasoning and conclusions in doubt. And suddenly you have to revise everything if this one thing is true. Science does one of two things: either it rejects that for a long time, as long as it can, until eventually the old generation passes on and a new generation which has grown up with familiarity with the new fact now simply takes it in and recasts the whole structure. And in the long run, we find ourselves revising this whole mass of facts again and again until we have lost faith. We have lost faith on the reliability of such knowledge. And this is the present situation, the end of modernity, and the beginning of a subjective turn where even the scientific world is beginning to accept that in the postmodern domain, we will just simply have to accept that there are many ways, perhaps, of interpreting. And there's a vagueness which is beginning to form, a subjectivity which is being accepted. Because all this building on sense perceptions with reasoning is not giving us any stable knowledge. But why are we doing all this accumulation of knowledge? So, partly for the pure satisfaction of the intellect. And this we see most commonly when you give some unusual facts. Did you know that? And you mention something quite unusual outside the domain of your imagination. You say, ah, that's interesting. I'm happy to know. You repeat that to others. Oh, that's interesting. You see a magic show, something abnormal presented. Oh, how did you do it? And there's just the satisfaction of knowing. It stops there. But the whole other side, which is the bigger pursuit, partly for practical efficiency and the added power which knowledge gives in managing our lives and lives of others. Knowledge is a force multiplier, and every time we know something better, we are able to wield and draw out of it greater possibilities. So it's actually a power and efficiency in managing lives. And in utilizing for human ends the overt or secret forces of nature. This is all about science. All of science is really digging deeper and deeper into these secret powers of nature. But then for what? Again, we are turning it to application, and the applications are twofold: in helping or hurting. And there is no other. In fact, you will see, unfortunately, on Earth, the bulk of our science has been driven by the military for hurting. And occasionally, a little bit of that leaks out into civilian world for helping, and that is kept as justification for all the military development, 90% of which remains hidden from the civilian development. Just as an example, the microwave oven was developed by the US military for its own troops and used by them for almost 15 years before it was finally brought out into the civilian world. Similarly, when people were using the old televisions with CRT tubes, with those scanning beams, big bulky things, and computer monitors, big bulky with radiation coming out from those screens, the technology for making these LCD screens was already very much present. The only reason they didn't bring it out into the public domain was that it would make it slightly more difficult to monitor what you're watching. It's a very interesting thing. When the television screen is drawing a picture in the old TV, there was a beam of electrons scanning. the pattern of scanning would send out radio waves, very subtle. And up to a certain distance of 100 meters or so, you could tune into those radio waves and get the exact picture of what was on your screen on your device. So it was a way by which the governments used to spy on people without them knowing, and there was no way you could defend yourself against that. And they did not want you to have LCD screens because they wouldn't be able to spy on you. All kinds of weird stories for all kinds of inventions like that, all of which would have tremendously improved human life and reduced pollution and destruction of the environment, but were not allowed to be brought. Just one example more I will give you. You know the old bulbs which with the tungsten wire inside, tungsten filament, incandescent bulb as they call it. Every time it is fused, it's because that wire has broken, right? And you have to throw away the whole bulb, buy a whole new one just for that tiny wire. And there was one man who patented a bulb with two or three filaments and a switch on the side to switch between them. So when one filament is fused, you switch to the next one. When that is fused, you switch to the next one. Maybe you could have five of them, why not? And straight away the bulb's lifespan is extended fivefold. The cost effectively is reduced fivefold. The wastage for the environment is reduced fivefold. Nobody would use it. Nobody wanted to do that because the industries depended on production and sales of numbers. Nobody cared for the environment, they cared only for their profits. I would expect that the government should have made it a law that all bulbs should have this option of the switch. Otherwise, you don't allow it to be produced. But that's how it is. So there is this whole mentality where the hurting somehow is much stronger than the helping, even though intentionally you may not be doing it. But the mindset is, if nothing else, hurting the environment for personal benefit. And he describes the two facets, saving and ennobling, or in oppressing and destroying our fellow men. You can save our fellow men, ennoble their lives. You can oppress and destroy our fellow men, drive them to collapse. And somehow there is this perverse tilt which is still very prominent in human affairs. But that's all there is. That's where the practical application of knowledge stops. Yoga indeed, so we will say, where is yoga in all this? Yoga indeed is commensurate with all life and can include all these subjects and objects. This is an extraordinary statement coming from Sri Aurobindo. Remember earlier right at the beginning, in the very first chapter, he had concluded with all life is yoga. The difference is the bulk of life is subconscious yoga, whereas for those who pursue yoga consciously, it is a conscious yoga. That's the only difference. So when you say all life is yoga, is all this also part of the yoga? He says, indeed, yoga is commensurate with all life and can include all these subjects and objects. That's a very important statement, and we'll see shortly how. There is even a yoga which can be used for self-indulgence as well as for self-conquest, for hurting others as well as for their salvation. There's a footnote here, and he says there is even a yoga which can be used for self-indulgence. So there's a footnote which goes, yoga develops power. It develops it even when we do not desire or consciously aim at it. And power is always a double-edged weapon which can be used to hurt or destroy, as well as to help and save. Be it also noted that all destruction is not evil. Just this one footnote opens up a whole controversial domain, which, if we were to perhaps speak openly in these terms, some people might get rather embarrassed or upset that we allow such things. There is a whole mass of the spiritual community for whom non-violence is the essence of spirituality. And he's saying here that all destruction is not evil. There's a whole mass that believes power is corrupting influence in spirituality. And here he says, well, power is there inevitably as part of any yogic development, even if you did not aim for it. And once you have the power, it can be used either way. So he says, yoga which can be used for self indulgence as well as for self conquest. Let's take a few examples of how that could work. There are many people who have taken to yoga with this intention. Sri Aurobindo himself began his yogic journey as part of his objective to make India free. And an incident happened where he saw this yogi who somebody was ill. I don't remember the details now. Somebody was very sick, and the yogi came to the house, asked for a glass of water, and with a knife cut across on the water with some mantras, and then gave the water to the patient. He drank the water and he was cured. And Sri Aurobindo recalls this incident and he said, well, if yoga can give you this power, then it can give you the power to free India. And that's how his quest began. And he said he took up yoga for the power to free India. If you think of it in these terms, many people turn to yoga for something like this: power to achieve something in life. It's not about realizing myself. That itself becomes quite abstract, even for those who say uh, realizing myself. Often it is a kind of an escape from the world because I have failed, I'm unable to manage things. Okay, now I want to get to the self because then I abandon responsibilities for the world. So it's more a running away than a real need to realize the self. But mostly it is because I need to be able to do something which I am unable to do. So very often I will share an incident. It was in Vishakhapatnam in the Indian Navy. We had a conference there with the naval officers. And then one man came and confided in his experience. He said for a long time he was struggling to get a certain promotion and he would always fail. I don't know if it was a promotion or he wanted a transfer, one of them, perhaps a transfer. Something which was he had to apply for it and it would not happen, it would get rejected. So at some point he said, well, it's not working, I need some help. And so he began to repeat the Gayatri Mantra 108 times every day. And just that concentration, that intensity of the build up, of course, creates ripples. And he said within 1 week, his transfer orders came. Now, if you see, the beginning of his spiritual journey might just have happened there. He suddenly realized that, oh, by doing just this much, something so extraordinary could be achieved. And he might just continue that repetition of the mantra, either as a way of, and he feels good, he feels this build-up of the energy and power, either as a continuation of that or as a way of further getting certain benefits as he proceeds in his life. Another example, which is more recent, when Narendra Modi was visiting the US, the new Indian Prime Minister, it so happened that it was during the period of the Navaratris, and he was on a fast, a very strict fast, drinking only lemon water and eating nothing else. And he held a series of more than 40 meetings within a span of 5 days, all of them very demanding. He sat through the White House dinner, sipping his lemon juice and water, and he met literally thousands of people. And apparently, it came in the newspaper that the US President Obama made a comment that he was amazed at the strength of his grip. He couldn't believe a man who had been on fast for by then 9 days could have such a strong grip. There was no sign of weakness. And he commented, I wonder what is this yoga thing which gives him so much energy. So it provoked many people to start thinking differently about this business of yoga. Obviously, there's something to it if you can see something so extraordinary in a person's behavior. So all of these are basically to do with the demonstration of a power, a human capacity pushed beyond human limits as a result of yoga, and then either a need for acquiring that capacity, an attraction to, or a need to fulfill some desire. So there is even a yoga which can be used for self-indulgence as well as for self-conquest. And the self-conquest comes more rarely. We find that we have certain limitations in our personality. We have a tendency perhaps to get upset, to get angry, and that is affecting our lives, our relationships. I'm not able to control my jealousy, my anger, my uh, worrying tendencies. And so I seek some basic meditation practices to try to calm my emotions, control my mind, and so on. So there is a need for self conquest to overcome some problem which is massively affecting my life. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered. But still, it is still a form of self conquest. And similarly, for hurting others as well as for their salvation. So when it comes to relating to others, so far it was all about oneself, self indulgence or self conquest. But others, similarly, there is the hurting or salvation. Unfortunately, there are even people who take to certain practices in order to gain power to influence others or even to harm others. Very rarely people do it to help others. But all of this, he says, can come under the purview of the overall yogic framework. So he says, yoga indeed is commensurate with all life and can include all these subjects and objects. I've not touched the most controversial of these, which would come under the category of what today passes for Tantra. I had once a conversation with a man who had gone very deep in a large number of tantric texts and had practiced a huge number of the processes described in those texts. Really, many of them. Many of them involved uh, practices which lasted several days, involving things which were quite unnatural and quite strange sounding, including going to cremation grounds and weird stuff like that. But he had done them all, and I was asking him something because I came from the background of having studied Sri Aurobindo. I said, well, the Tantra that I understand, Tantra is about ultimately about attaining to self. And this man shook his head and he said, I have read several hundreds of texts in their original. Not one of them have I found speaking of self realization. And then, of course, I remembered Sri Aurobindo even mentions this. He says, unfortunately, the whole tantric, whatever may have been the origin of the tantric approach, it lost itself in the in understanding or mastering the various powers of nature. And each of the texts which this man had studied was basically about how to gain this power. Here's the formula, and as a result of that formula, you will gain this power. And he described some quite amazing things which he had experienced. But at the end of all that, if you really thought about it, you would not find even one of them of real value. It's the famous story of Ramakrishna Paramahans when somebody comes to him and says, I've spent the last 10 years doing this great practice that gave me the power now to walk on water. And Ramakrishna says, you wasted 10 years because for 10 paisa you could have had the boatman take you across. If you think about it in such terms, none of those things he had was of any real value. Even somebody who claimed at least to have had the power of materialization, when it came to the crunch, he said, it's no different than asking a servant to go and buy something from the shop. You give money to your servant and say, bring soap from the shop. The only difference is the servant here is this being in the subtle world. You have to give it what it wants, and then it does the materialization for you. At the end of the day, what have you benefited? You have only to end up paying that creature, and the price you pay is far more. And often the price you pay is the loss of your personal freedom. So, this is just briefly to touch upon that domain, which is not at all very nice. Unfortunately, so much of the Tantra has been reduced to just this accumulation of powers, and yet there are people who dedicate their lives to this kind of yoga, as they would call it. There are also people who have developed or acquired powers of seeing things at a distance or reading minds by such means. And all of them involve getting into a relationship with one of these subtle beings. And that's where the dangers always lie, because the beings will demand from you their own compensation. I don't know if I have mentioned here the incident narrated to me by one Atma Tattva Das, E.T. Das from the ISKCON movement. Briefly, he was part of the DK movement in Tamil Nadu, which was anti spiritual, anti yoga, anti God, anti everything not material. And he decided to prove once and for all that the tantrics were fake. So he crossed over from the Tamil Nadu border into Kerala, which is still a hotbed of tantra practitioners of this kind, and joined a tantric group which was living in the forest to see from the inside and eventually to expose them. That was his intention. But of course, he ended up himself being converted to their beliefs because he saw for himself that what they were doing was real. So he mentioned one event where they had all gathered for a special invocation in the night in the middle of the forest. And they said they were going to do a special prayer to invoke a certain deity, the goddess. And they all sat down and they told him, when you smell a perfume, you know the goddess is going to appear soon. At that point, make sure you keep your eyes looking down. Do not look up. You will be strongly tempted to look up. And he said, why? What will happen if I look up? They said, if you look up, the goddess is so beautiful, you will forget to ask your boon. You have to look down, and then she will ask you what you want, and you say what you want. So this man fortunately had a different sense, and he said, oh, if this is what it is, I would rather look at the face of the Divine Godmother than to ask for a boon. So, in fact, when the puja was ending, he said there was a strong perfume and a presence which was felt, and the form of the goddess appeared. And he said he did look up, and of course, he lost himself, he forgot everything, and it was such a beautiful scene. But I'm just pointing out the mindset of many of these people. Here is an opportunity to invoke a form of divinity, and you're busy thinking of what you want to ask rather than receive what something far more valuable which could come. But that too is a pursuit of the yoga, perhaps an inferior pursuit, and comes into the larger framework of all life being yoga. But, and this is the correction now to our vision, so far we have looked at something which is quite narrow and petty. And Sri Aurobindo, as if zooms out to show you the big picture. But all life, in quote marks, all life includes not only, not even mainly, life as humanity now leads it. So straight away now your whole perspective is changed. So far we are discussing life as we are leading it, and within that, everything is included in the larger yogic sense. Because each one of these experiences will push you a little further towards the divine eventually. But then he says all life includes not only, not even mainly, life as humanity now leads it. We could have said It is mainly life as humanity leads it. No, it's not even mainly. It's not even only. There's a huge life that is beyond what humanity leads, of which this tiny part is what humanity currently leads. And he's now expanding the picture to this. It envisages rather and regards as its one true object a higher, truly conscious existence which our half conscious humanity does not yet possess and can only arrive at by self exceeding spiritual ascension. So we have a life which is the current life as humanity now leads it, and there's a whole range of life which is inaccessible currently to humanity. In order to access it, humanity has to exceed itself spiritually. Then only we can possess it, because we as humanity are still half conscious. As we ascend to this higher life, there we would become fully conscious. Now, it's a strange thing if you look at somebody, if you say to someone, do you know you are half conscious? Say, no, I'm fully conscious of myself. But the fact is, we are half conscious because we actually don't know ourselves. We know only in our awareness what's immediately happening in a narrow part of our mind and what we see through that narrow part of the mind. The bulk of us, which is behind and above and encompassing, is unknown to us. We might even say the bulk of us actually extends to include the totality of the universe, and we are entirely unconscious of it. So, that would be natural for this higher range of life. So, what we are seeing here when he says all life is yoga, there is this huge range which is all life. Of that, there's a tiny bulge below, a lump, which is the current life of humanity as it now leads it. In a half conscious condition, and above that is this higher, truly conscious existence, which we can only arrive at by a self exceeding spiritual ascension. And the problem is we have to get free from ourselves. If we remain what we are stuck in this lower life. We have to become free of ourselves. How exactly do we do that? And it becomes the chicken and egg question. Unless I taste the higher life and experience what it's like to be more conscious, how will I ever know that I'm unconscious or half conscious? On the other hand, if uh, if I continue to work as I am, I will never get to that. So somewhere we have to be able to break out. What is this self-exceeding spiritual ascension? How am I going to ascend and exceed myself with my own current efforts, which are obviously not enough? So all that will come later. It is this greater consciousness and higher existence which is the peculiar and appropriate object of yogic discipline. And so suddenly the whole focus of yogic discipline is this higher range. And he uses two words, greater consciousness and higher existence. And of both of these now he will elaborate. So when we speak of yogic discipline, it will be for these objects only. This greater consciousness, this higher existence, are not an enlightened or illumined mentality. So when we first speak of something new, of which we have no experience, the requirement is to dissociate it first from all the wrong associations. If I'm going to speak to you about a new sense, and I'm going to call it now the 12th sense, you'll say, oh, is it the ability to see and hear at the same time? No, and so on. It has to start by cutting off all the associations we have with sense itself. Okay, we'll just ignore that as a hypothetical example. But if we're going to speak of higher consciousness, which is so different from ours that we need to exceed ourselves, and we have nothing in our current consciousness by which we can experience it, how am I going to know it? So, first, I have to know that it's not what I think it is. It's not an extension of myself, it's not an exaggeration where now I can look at a range of 60 degrees, and then in that consciousness, I will look at a range of 180 degrees. It's not just an expansion and enlargement. It's not that I'll have 10 times more energy, 10 times more brain power. It's not an exaggeration of what I am, because that's all I can imagine myself to be. So these are not an enlightened or illumined mentality supported by greater dynamic energy or supporting a purer moral life and character. So these are the four facets of exaggeration by which we tend to view the spiritual life. And that's the reason why, when in the conventional world you speak of spiritual life, most people will say, well, it does not interest me now. When I retire, when I don't have anything else to do, then I can view it. But the associations are really an exaggeration of this, the exaggeration of the current mentality. So, enlightened or illumined mentality, that is, my same mind will get more enlightened, having more light, or more energy, or purer moral life, purer character. And especially the last two, which are the point where most young people simply stay away from spirituality. The first two, interestingly, have become more attractive, especially in the business world, and to some extent, even in the armed forces, where we find we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough intelligence to deal with the practical problems of life as the world is growing more complex and more fast. We have to take decisions based on partial, incomplete, and even wrong information. We need some greater facility. So, an illumined mentality and greater energy are highly valued now. In the armed forces, similarly, more energy is, of course, obviously a benefit. But for many of those who have been in battlegrounds, they come back with enormous traumas, psychological problems. It's a very interesting study which showed that when people in the battlefield have to shoot to kill another human being, inevitably the gun slightly tilts up and they end up missing, shooting just above the head and missing, and the other fellow runs away. And they found it was almost like 70 or 80% of the people ended up involuntarily moving the gun slightly just to miss. And it's because even our deepest physical instinct cringes from killing another human being, and that's what you're ordered to do. So the body itself revolts and misses. But when you do end up killing, when you do see the results, perhaps of a bomb shot through a video camera from a UAV, and you're not even nearby, you see children, innocent people being killed. You wonder. But at some point, because you are responsible, there's a whole karmic entanglement, and the whole thing hits you painfully. And even if you're not conscious on the surface, it enters the subliminal, comes up in sleep state, dream state, and eventually comes forward as this post traumatic stress disorder. And a very large number of US Army men who have come back from the battlefield end up committing suicide because, let's put it in a very coarse way, the ghosts of the people they have killed haunt them. It comes to that in some form. And the one thing they found helpful was to get these people to start meditating. And it made a huge difference, not only in their relationship with themselves, but in their acceptance of what had happened. But on the other side, it changed them profoundly. And it is unlikely they could go back on the battlefield and kill. But at least it freed them from the terrible mess that they got into psychologically. So we see something happening where two of these are already being recognized. Purer moral life and character is still not valued in humanity, but I do think a point may come when it will be. But with all that, An exaggeration around these four lines is not still that greater consciousness, that higher existence. So two words are being used: greater consciousness and higher existence. And the consciousness being greater is the way we are aware of the world and of ourselves. Existence being greater is the state in which we are as a being, as a person. And there are two facets of each other. Their superiority to the ordinary human consciousness is not in degree but in kind and essence. So it's not an exaggeration of the human consciousness to higher degree. But the kind of consciousness itself is different. The essential nature of your existence is different. So the kind and essence refer to consciousness and existence. Kind of consciousness is different. It's different way of being aware, and the existences of a different essentiality. There is a change not merely on the surface or instrumental manner of our being, but of its very foundation and dynamic principle. These are all terms which are too vague when we just think about it. Sri Aurobindo, of course, elaborates, and we will see that shortly. But the foundation of our being, what is that? We're not even conscious of what is the foundation of our current being. It's a very interesting exercise to try to observe what's the basis of my awareness, of my existence. Why do I say I'm aware? Why do I say I exist? Can you really become conscious of that? It's a very interesting exercise because you discover very quickly that there is one thing which you will feel as a foundation, and then you find, except when it's something else. And there are exceptions. You find the foundation which you feel is itself changing. And you end up with two or three different kinds of foundations. And so obviously there has to be a foundation which is the foundation of all these three. And you have to go deeper. And at that point you realize you're not actually conscious. You're not aware of what that foundation is. You may sense it intuitively, or there must be, there is, I'm not aware of it anymore. And that's where you're entering this domain which is subliminal. And what is the dynamic principle? What is it that drives you to action, to expression? Again, ask yourself, what is it that is your deepest push of action? What makes you be dynamic at all? That's a question we've never asked, we've never introspected. But if we do, we may again find, oh, there is this, and then there is that, and then there is that. My desires drive me, for example. My urge to know drives me. When I see pain in others, I'm driven to reach out, to give support. You may find several things which drive you, which form the basis of your personality's deeper motives. But is there something more profound which is like a foundational drive to all of them? And again, I sense there must be, but I'm not aware of it anymore. It's beyond the range of my awareness. So he says this is a change for the greater consciousness and higher existence. The change is not merely of the surface or instrumental manner of our being, but of its very foundation and dynamic principle. Whatever it is currently, that is replaced by something completely different. Yogic knowledge seeks to enter into a secret consciousness beyond mind, which is only occultly here concealed at the base of all existence. So, had we been able to cut through all these superficial foundations and drives which we have, we might get to something more occult, more hidden. And it is actually in that hidden space that we have the secret consciousness beyond mind, which is only occultly here. It is here, it's not somewhere else, it's not far away, it's not kept on a tree on the other side of the world. It's not in some high heaven. It is right here, but it is occultly here. You are not aware of it. You cannot be aware of it. It is hidden behind a screen, concealed at the base of all existence. And if all of my existence were to be taken back until there was one common base, that's where it is concealed. For it is that consciousness alone that truly knows, and only by its possession can we possess God and rightly know the world and its real nature and secret forces. So this is now the importance of this consciousness. It is that consciousness alone that truly knows, and only by its possession can we possess God and rightly know the world and its real nature and secret forces. We know the world, perhaps even we feel we know God. We also feel that we know things, we have knowledge. But true knowledge, which is something of a different order, which is not this shifting, unstable mass of facts and logical conclusions, that true knowledge can be had only in that consciousness. It cannot be had in any other level in between. Second, we cannot possess God. We may know in terms of having a concept of God, but we cannot possess in experience, in identity, unless we possess that consciousness. Because only that consciousness is able to experience identity and know God, therefore, in possession. And similarly, we know the world. I'm already experiencing the world, but I do not know the world rightly. And this is happening all the time in my life. Every time I have an interaction, either I have partly understood or have wrongly understood. I cannot seem to always know exactly what I'm supposed to know. Even in a simple conversation, you will find so much happens which is misunderstanding or wrong understanding. Much less when we look at the totality of the world, there's so much more that is now wrong and misunderstood. Rightly know the world and its real nature and secret forces. So, assuming therefore that there is a real nature to the world and there are, of course, enormous secret forces behind, we can only rightly know them when we are in that consciousness because it alone can know. So, what we are dealing with here is a consciousness whose ability to know is different from the current mental consciousness and its ability to know. And this is the status of knowledge, the status of that consciousness and its knowledge. That's what everything is pointing to. All this world visible or sensible to us, and all too in it that is not visible, is merely the phenomenal expression of something beyond the mind and the senses. The knowledge which the senses and intellectual reasoning from the data of the senses can bring us is not true knowledge. It is a science of appearances. And in just one sentence, he has captured the essence of all of modern science and modern accumulation of knowledge and data. What we have done in all of these hundreds of years of pursuit of knowledge of the world is to describe the appearances of things. If you ask this question, why, to a physicist or a biologist or a psychologist, whichever field you may choose, take a field in which people are most confident and just ask why. They will give a reply. And then you ask why again, they will give another reply. And when you ask why a third time, they will get flustered. But they may still manage a reply. And then if you ask why a fourth time, generally by the fourth time, that's how it is. And you can still ask why, that's how it is. That breaks out. Why is reality the way it is? And suddenly you are in a different domain. There must be, intuitively, we know, there must be a reason why reality is the way it is. But we have no way of knowing why. It is outside the domain entirely of our senses and even of our logic, beyond mind. So, the knowledge which the senses and intellectual reasoning from the data of the senses can bring us is not true knowledge. It is a science of appearances. And that's what we have done, is to describe appearances. Why is it like this? Because that's how it is. This is the essence of all of our human knowledge and science, because that's how it is. But if we ask why things are the way they are, then we realize there is something which has chosen to put things the way they are. And that something, therefore, is a more true reality, more free, more ultimate, of which this is phenomenon, process, appearance. So, all this world, visible or sensible to us, and all to in it that is not visible, is merely the phenomenal expression of something beyond the mind and the senses. And we can see how we just cannot get to the why the world is the world as it is. We can't get to that answer with our mind. The only way we could get to it would be if I know the one who made the world as it is. If I know him not as a face, not as a person, because that would be part of the world, I must know him in the intention which drove him to express the world as it is. I must be one with him, with his motivation, with his drive, with his desire, with his energy, with his mind, with his knowledge. I must be one with him to be able to know why the world is the way it is. And that comes in an identity of consciousness which is like him, which is of him, which is a part of him. And that's what is the deepest foundation within us, occult still. And that's where you will have true knowledge. Everything else will be only science of appearances. And even appearances cannot be properly known unless we know first the reality of which they are images. Now, Sri Aurobindo brings in a new dimension. Okay, you could know that one who chose to make the universe as it is, or we may stop short of that and say, at least I know the way the universe is. I don't know why it is like that, but at least I know that it is like that. But he says that's not enough. If you don't know why he made it like that, then you don't truly know the universe. Something is missing already. So he says you have to bring in the relationship between the two. Even the appearances cannot be properly known unless we know first the reality of which they are images. So now there's an interesting suggestion in the phrasing. All the appearances of the phenomenon are actually representing the reality underlying. They are images of that which are being projected. So when the one behind chooses to manifest the universe, where is he manifesting it out of? Out of himself. Therefore, everything that he expresses is an expression of himself. And therefore, everything that is in form is an image of him. And that's something very interesting. If everything in the universe is an expression of him as an image of him, then there is already something which we may call his essential image and his phenomenal image. Of course, in the essential image, we may not use the word image anymore, but his essence and in the phenomenal image which represents his image. In the biblical tradition, they say God made man in his own image. Unfortunately, that has been taken very literally, that God has two hands and two eyes and a nose and things like that. But it is in this sense that we can see the truth of it. And we can even extend it to say the whole universe is made in his image. But then we cannot know truly this phenomenon unless we know it in relation to that essential image of which this is an image. Because from that essential image, one could express in many different images. The universe could have been formed in many different ways. Perhaps somewhere on some level we may discover that there are actually many universes formed in many different ways with completely different principles and laws simultaneously existing in different space and time experiences, all of which are simultaneously his self expression. But why is this universe the way it is and that universe the way that is? And why is the totality the way that is? Eventually, if you do not see why he chose this image as his self expression, if you do not see it in relation to him, you do not know this image truly. Because after all, it is his self expression. This reality behind is their self, the self of all these images. And there is one self of all. So now here's a greater complexity. There are so many images put out in the phenomenal expression. The self of all these images in that reality, and that self is one. From that oneness, all of these images have come forward. In other words, within each image, that oneness is concealed and expressing itself differently. And if it is concealed and is now revealing itself more and more, there is a destiny to each of these images. There is a destiny to the totality of all these images and their relationships. There is something which is meant to be, which is far beyond anything we can imagine, because the origin of each of these is beyond what we can imagine. And if that is concealed in all the images and unfolding, then the outcome of it all is also beyond our imagination, but is already implied in what things are like. So we cannot know the universe truly if we do not know its fulfillment, its eventual outcome, which is hidden in the source. This reality is their self, and there is one self of all. When that is seized, all other things can then be known in their truth and no longer as now only in their appearance. So you will feel in the flower the living presence of the divine and what it is choosing to express and why and how and where it is all moving towards, because it will be a living reality, not just a phenomenal appearance. So now we have already got from this reading the sense of a deeper knowledge, a deeper consciousness which is able to know differently, which is already within us, occult. There is this superficial knowledge which is formed of sensory facts and logical accumulation. And we are now dealing with the knowledge which is of that inner consciousness in a very different way, which, when we attain to, would give us a greater consciousness and a higher existence, completely different, but which is life. So the life we're seeing today, part of the superficial mind-based organization, is this very little thing, and then there's this massive, huge possibility of life waiting beyond the domain of what we are currently able to access. How do we get to that then? What means do we have to go from here to there? Remember, he said earlier, we can only arrive at it by self exceeding spiritual ascension. We have to exceed ourselves. What method can we use to exceed ourselves? Because all the methods are part of ourselves. It's like if you keep running fast enough, you will end up in a different dimension, but that doesn't work. So, what is there in us which would allow us to be able to know that? And he deals with this now. It is evident that however much we may analyze the physical and sensible, we cannot by that means arrive at the knowledge of the self, or of ourselves, or of that which we call God. Knowledge with a capital K being this greater knowledge in identity of that underlying reality. So we cannot arrive at the knowledge of the self, or even the knowledge of ourselves, or the knowledge of that which we call God, by any means of physical and sensible analysis. And again, he says it is evident that. Why is it evident? Because all of these physical means and sensible means are part of the phenomenon. And within the phenomenon, there is nothing which can give you back the reality out of which the phenomenon emerged. Because the reality has got concealed. That last question, which you can ask to a scientist, why is the world the way it is? That's how it is. We can't go further. Then he now describes what are the physical means. And there's something extraordinary in this passage. The telescope, the microscope, the scalpel, the retort, and alembic cannot go beyond the physical, although they may arrive at subtler and subtler truths about the physical. If then we confine ourselves to what the senses and their physical aids reveal to us and refuse from the beginning to admit any other reality or any other means of knowledge, we are obliged to conclude that nothing is real except the physical, and that there is no self in us or in the universe, no God within and without, no ourselves even, except this aggregate of brain, nerves, and body. But this we are only obliged to conclude because we have assumed it firmly from the beginning, and therefore cannot but circle around to our original assumption. So, in 3 sentences, he has described the present jam of modern science, but with some very extraordinary insights. So, first, let's look at the big picture. We started by assuming that if we used physical means, then we would be able to get to the subtler reality, because the subtler reality must be an expression of physical reality. Obviously, we don't get to it because the subtler reality is not the physical reality in a subtler form. And so, since we do not find it, we conclude that there is no self, no God, no ourselves except brain, nerves, and body. But that's how we assumed it. We assumed wrongly, and so we circled around and came back to that wrong assumption as our conclusion. And this is where science is stuck. But what are the physical means of science to get to deeper realities? Because after all, science is also looking for the ultimate reality. And he lists them, and there's something very profound in this description. The telescope, the microscope, the scalpel, the retort, and alembic cannot go beyond the physical, although they may arrive at subtler and subtler truths about the physical. Now, he's listed 5 instruments of science, and each of these is symbolic of a certain method, a process of pursuit of reality. The telescope is an instrument which is allowing us to look far, to bring that which is far away beyond our sight into the domain of our sight. So, science uses actually 5 means of exploring and seeking the underlying reality. And the first of these is to bring by instruments something which is far and inaccessible close to us. Now, by extension, this would include also the ability to see in ranges of sight which our eyes cannot. So, radio waves, ultraviolet, infrared, etc., which are outside the domain of our sight. The telescope, in this case, radio telescope or infrared telescope, or other devices similarly, are able to take things of that domain outside our reach and bring them into our domain of perception. So this is the first device used. Second is microscope, which takes something which is very close but too small for us to access, and which enlarges, which amplifies, which extends to reveal detail which is not possible to see in the normal scope. Now, the principle again, if you recognize the principle behind this instrument, you can extend this to include a whole range of instruments, including what we call spectrum analyzers and any instrument which amplifies and reveals more detail which normally our senses could not see. So you will see, for example, a sound engineer records a sound, sees the sound waves. It's as if he has expanded it within time and space. And then he manipulates at that level. And that would be part of this principle of the microscope, enlarging to reveal detail richer and then manipulating even. The third, the scalpel, is an instrument that cuts and takes you to a layer behind. You see the skin, you cut, and inside there's something else. The skin may have been white, black, brown, yellow, red, but when I cut inside, it's all red blood, tissue, bone, which I could not see. I could perhaps feel, but I could not see. The ability to cut through layers of surface by different instruments is the third means of science to go deeper. And this again, when you recognize the principle, you will include a whole range of devices which are not just the scalpel. For example, the X-ray, which allows us to see the bone, or the ultrasonic scanner, which allows us to see again inside, the MRI scan and CAT scan, etc., which allows you to look inside things. So this is the third method of looking inside. So the first was to bring something far away close. The second is to bring out richer detail, to enlarge, amplify. The third, to peel off layers, to look at reality behind, deeper, to go in depth. The fourth is the retort. And the retort is a device used in chemistry for distillation. So you have a liquid, let's say plant extracts, which you heat up, and there are fine vapors which come out, and they are directed to the top, and then they're condensed, and you have distilled, extracted subtler substance. Okay, so it's a process of distillation, and retort is a device which allows you to distill. When you see crude oil, the retort is the device by which at different levels you are able to extract finer and finer uh, gradations of petroleum from the crude oil. And you have at least 5 or 6 which are differently used in the industry. So the retort is the device for extracting the subtler essence out of a cruder form. So in the plant, for example, we are able to see that the plant juice has things in its subtler working which are of tremendous value. In the blood, we have the blood plasma, and we are able to sift out and separate subtler things, red blood cells, white blood cells. And this fourth method is basically distilling, separating, and drawing out the finer gradations of substance out of the coarser mixture which is involved. And so this is the fourth method of science to go deeper into reality. And the fifth, the alembic, is also similar to the distilling retort, but the difference is the alembic allows you to transmute one substance into a different grade of substance. So this would be the method, for example, by which the more obvious form would be simply that you can take vapor, water vapor, and condense it to water, or you could take ice and evaporate it and study the vapor. So you transmute gradations to be able to study them better. You crystallize water vapor, and then you can study crystals. You evaporate the crystals, and you can study the nature of the gas of water. And it allows you to reveal deeper nuances of the nature of substance. If you look at the whole of science and all the instruments of our exploration of the world, you'll find they all boil down to these 5 broad methods. In each of these methods, there are so many instruments we have made for doing this in different ways, in different fields, in sound, in light, in other media. But it all boils down to these 5 methods finally. So it's very interesting. Sri Aurobindo, if he ever uses one word, you should always ask yourself why he has used that word. And if he has bothered to say telescope, microscope, and scalpel, we should never dismiss. We should always look what's behind it. And especially when he uses words like retort and alembic, which are highly technical words. And it's not like he had to look up a dictionary. He had these words somewhere and he drew them out to say something very specific. So we have now five broad methods by which the pursuit of knowledge in the material domain is extended. But he says all of these five cannot go beyond the physical, although they may arrive at subtler and subtler truths about the physical. And how far can you go? In fact, in the old days, maybe even 200 years ago, there was still the remnant, both in Eastern and Western science, of the idea of five elements. And the subtlest was considered the ether element. So, in Western science, for example, in Europe, they spoke of the ether as the medium for the waves of light. At least that was assumed. And so there was always an attempt to find this ether medium and to detect it. The whole theory of magnetism and electricity was built around the concept of an ether flow. In fact, though, when they tried to detect the ether, they found it somewhat inaccessible to the instruments of that time. The result was an assumption that perhaps ether doesn't exist. Rather than saying perhaps our instruments are not sufficiently sensitive, they said perhaps ether doesn't exist. And then science took a very different turn, unfortunately. But just before that, when they found refined gradations of substance, there was a tendency, because they were looking for the ether, there was a tendency to name the most fine of them as an ether. And you'll see in medicine, even today, there is use of this word ether to describe the vapor of alcohol, and because especially because of its effect of sedation and to make desensitize the nerves. And because it had that effect, and because they knew that the nervous system also rested enormously on the life energy flow, and here was very fine vaporous substance which could block sensations in the nerves, they were tempted to call it an ether, and that term still remains. My point here is though, there is this tendency to go to subtler and subtler grades. At some point, perhaps the instruments can't detect, but there is still a subtler grade. In writing in 1915 in The Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo noted that ether can and does exist. That was 10 years after ether had been rejected by Einstein. And Einstein did not prove ether doesn't exist. He just said, let's assume it doesn't exist. There were many tests subsequently with refined instruments which did detect it, but by then science had taken a different turn. So in 1915, Sri Aurobindo asserts, knowing full well that science has rejected it, he says that ether can and does exist, even if for our present instruments it is still too fine to be able to detect. Subsequently, of course, our instruments have become much more refined, and there are many evidences of this underlying substance, which we can say is physical, and yet it is so refined as to be almost subtle, almost non physical. And perhaps it is even the substance which mediates between the subtle world and the gross physical. But the point being, with these five approaches, which are the only approaches possible by instrumental means of the senses and of logic, we are able to only arrive at subtler and subtler truths about the physical. Now, so far, in all our discussions of the phenomenal world and the phenomenal exploration of knowledge, there were always two powers. One was the physical senses, and the second was the logic, the rationality, which works on the data from the physical senses. When we look at these five tools of the physical senses, on each of these tools there is an equivalent rational process. So, in the telescope, for example, which brings something far near, the rationality also has a similar method of deduction by which something which is far inaccessible can be made in context of something closer. There's similarly the microscope. By induction, we expand between two things, we discover finer, richer detail. There is a scalpel which cuts through, and this is the logic that cuts through contradictions and is able to peel off layers logically. And then the retort, which looks at deeper, subtler causes of logical outcomes, and the alembic, which looks at complementary, subtler implications. So you will find there is on all five instruments not only a gross physical sensory approach, but also an logical, rational, equivalent approach. But the two together still cannot get you anything beyond the physical, however subtle you are within the physical. So if we confine ourselves, logically then, if we confine ourselves to what the senses and their physical aids reveal to us, and refuse from the beginning to admit any other reality or any other means of knowledge, then we are obliged to come to the conclusion, obviously, no God, no self, no ourselves. What is it that we have rejected and the error made by science, by physical science? We confined ourselves to the senses and their physical aids. We refuse to admit other reality and we refuse to admit other means of knowledge. These are the three errors. He's articulating it in a complementary way. First, we have limited ourselves. This is all we will use. And then we could still say that there are other domains, other gradations of reality. We could still say there are other means of knowledge which I reject and I limit myself to these. But we have even rejected that possibility. There are no other domains except the physical. There is no other way of knowledge except the physical. And the tools that I will use, therefore, are only physical. And therefore, by the circular logic, we come back to the conclusion there is nothing other than the physical. And in the process, what have we thrown out? We are obliged to conclude that nothing is real except the physical, and that there is no self in us or in the universe, no God within and without, no ourselves except this aggregate of brain, nerves, and body. So, in the way he articulates, it's very important the subtle distinctions he makes. First, there is no self in us or in the universe. There could have been an introspective quest, we would have discovered the self within. If we had allowed other means of knowledge. Similarly, if we admitted other levels of reality, we could have had an external pursuit which would have got us to the recognition of a self in the universe. But again, we removed that. Next, no God within and without. Again, if we allowed ourselves other means of knowledge, subjective, we would have discovered within ourselves that divine presence. If we allowed ourselves other gradations of reality and essential reality, which is formless, spaceless, timeless, underlying, we would have still discovered that oneness behind, out of which the universe is expressed. But these two are removed, and then even we are nothing except brain, nerves, and body because that's all we can detect. Because we limited ourselves only to physical instruments that can cut. Now, there's interesting experiments to detect the soul using scalpel and other tools. They even got to the point where they claimed to have found the seat of the soul in the brain, in the pineal gland. If you knock that out, the person doesn't survive. So obviously the soul should be seated there, and so on. They even tried to measure the soul when a person dies. The person was placed on a weighing scale. At the moment of death, they found a loss of weight of 1 gram. And so they said, we have now detected the weight of the soul. So soul was reduced to a measurable substance having a measurable weight. And all of these were wrong conclusions because they did not recognize that there can be other gradations of reality, the subtle physical body, which disengages from the gross physical. That was the weight difference which was measured, and it is nowhere near the soul. And many other experiments of this kind were attempts to recognize physical subtler realities. were misunderstood. When, for example, the human aura was photographed using what is called Killian photography, where the body is exposed to high voltage and there's a discharge of the high voltage which follows a pattern which can be photographed, and it follows the pattern of what we would call the aura. It's not the aura itself, but it's the aura being lit up by the electric field that is put on it and then measured by image, by photography. They claimed, therefore, the aura was electrical in nature, and the aura itself had, therefore, certain physical properties. Again, one can say partly true because the grossest part of the aura approaches the physical and engages with the physical, but the subtlest part is still lost because it represents a different grade of reality. And so there was a tendency of reductionism precisely because of this wrong starting point. In yoga, the correction we make, and this is the correction we would like to bring into science at some stage, we would start by saying that we will not confine ourselves to the senses and their physical aids and what they reveal to us. We will accept things which are outside the gross physical senses and the subtler aids which can be added to the physical senses. In fact, Killian photography comes close to that, but not yet it. Second, we will accept that there are other gradations of reality. And to be able to cognize them, to know them truly, there is an equivalent grade of knowledge and means of knowledge corresponding to each of those levels of reality. Now, this is very easily validated subjectively in our own dream experiences, where we have all had, without exception, all of us have had dreams where we were full of such intense emotion that we woke up from the intensity of the emotion. Sometimes it is an intense sensation of happiness, or intense sadness, or intense pleasure, or intense pain, and you find yourself perhaps intensely weeping, and the intensity is such that it shakes you up and you wake up from that intensity. The nerves can't handle it. And if you're conscious in the state before you woke up, just as you woke up, you will notice as you return to the gross physical body awareness, that intensity rapidly dulls. And the most intense part was when you were in the non physical grade of awareness in the subtle body. We would, in the yogic term, we would use the vital body, which is itself substance of life force, and therefore it is the emotion that it experiences. In the gross body or the mind has emotions. The emotions are almost like a reflection, like a phenomenon playing on the surface. But in the life body, in the pranamaya kosha, emotion is the reality of your substance. And that's why this kind of intensity is possible. Similarly, in the mental body, in the manomaya kosha, thought is your reality, is your substance. And so there's a whole different way of experiencing the mental world, which is quite different from the gross physical world, or even different from the vital world. And it requires even a certain skill to become aware on that level in its own terms, to be conscious in your dream and to be able to have lucid dreams deliberately. And so we see gradations of reality, gradations of substance corresponding to reality, and gradations of cognition, way of knowledge, means of knowledge corresponding to each of these. And we will accept that as our starting point. If these three corrections we can make, science and yoga would be almost equivalent in their quest. After all, both are seeking to realize the ultimate reality. And the only conflict that exists currently is on these 3 points, starting points, assumptions, and means. And if these three can be corrected, there is really no big difference. And that's why yoga is really a science of consciousness, an exploration of consciousness, leading not only to knowledge but mastery of self and of all reality. So the next paragraph, Sri Aurobindo says, if then there is a self, a reality not obvious to the senses, it must be by other means than those of physical science that it is to be sought and known. The intellect is not that means. And so he continues, which we will take up next time. Now, for now, we can pause here and take up any questions or any comments. Okay. You're okay. You're not reading from the text. You're just saying. Okay. The question is, does the realization of that reality give us the knowledge of the rest by itself? The answer I would articulate in this way: it depends on what was the intention with which you started. If you took a very narrow, concentrated, blinkered pursuit to know that reality in itself, but blinkered, cutting off all things, you have already imposed on your quest a limitation. You have refused all else, right? So if you started with the assumption that that reality is not of this world and has nothing to do with this world, those are the blinkers you have put. You will get to the experience of that reality with your blinkers, and then you will not see its connection with the world. And that's why our presuppositions, even before we begin the spiritual journey, are extremely important, because, especially in the beginning, all our experiences tend to be mixed, conditioned by our expectations and our fixed ideas. If right from the beginning we have accepted that that reality and this world involve a continuity, the world is an expression of that reality, and the knowledge of that reality includes the knowledge of this world, then we would approach it and from there be able to turn back to the world and see it as a manifestation of that. Still, now the question remains, can we then know specifics, fine details? And the answer to that would be, once we are seated in that reality, yes, we can know specifics, but we should want to. So again, you may be seated in that reality with a wide vision and not choose to go into specifics. The knowledge would still be there, implied, but not overt. Or you could choose to make overt, concentrate to know something specific, and then it would come forward. Yes, this is how it is. And this is the way you will find many yogis are able to access knowledge which would not be normally available to them. So, in practice, when you are in the body, when you need to know something, then that knowledge would be accessible to you. Or you may need to want to know, and then it would be accessible to you. A lot depends at that point on how much the mental and physical consciousness have been taken into that experience. If they are not taken in fully, then they act like screens, dulling the effect of that deeper knowledge. So you could go into trance and have access to all that knowledge. When you come out, it's as if the whole thing gets dulled. You have to make an effort. And even when the knowledge is had, because it is now being reflected in an inferior cognitive power of mind, it gets slightly distorted. And then the vocabulary, which is limited, further distorts it, and so on. So for Sri Aurobindo, it would not be complete until all of these other parts of us, the instrumental nature, will be equally perfected, that could come straight through. In the subsequent paragraphs, Sri Aurobindo will discuss what are the other means of knowledge and other gradations of reality which we can rely upon and which we must develop in order to complete this process and come to the recognition of that underlying reality. So it's a very interesting chapter.